On February 1, 2026, President Donald Trump stood before cameras and declared his intention to transform 3 sovereign nations into American states. Canada would be the 51st state, Greenland the 52nd, Venezuela the 53rd. This wasn't campaign rhetoric or casual provocation. This was the President of the United States publicly announcing territorial expansion plans targeting a NATO ally, a Danish territory, and a South American nation, countries totaling over 50 million people and spanning from the Arctic to the Caribbean. The statement seemed absurd. Modern democracies don't annex their neighbors. The age of territorial conquest ended with World War II. International law, the United Nations Charter, and 80 years of precedent have made forcible annexation unacceptable in civilized international relations. Yet Trump wasn't joking. For over a year, he had systematically pressured Canada through tariffs, threats, and public humiliation of Canadian leaders. He had offered economic incentives for annexation. He had reportedly contacted separatist movements in Canadian provinces. And he had weaponized America's economic dominance to make Canada's continued independence increasingly costly. This documentary examines Trump's campaign to annex Canada, how it developed, why it matters beyond symbolic provocation, and what it reveals about the changing nature of territorial ambition in the 21st century. What you're about to witness isn't simply about one president's unusual fixation. It's about whether economic coercion can replace military conquest as the mechanism of empire. It's about whether sovereignty can be purchased, pressured, or traded away rather than seized by force. And it's about how proximity to overwhelming power shapes the choices available to even prosperous, stable democracies. The world's longest undefended border may be about to become the newest fault line in a geopolitical order where the rules established after 1945 are being systematically challenged by the very nation that created them. Trump's Canada obsession didn't emerge in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern of territorial expansion ambitions that began in his first presidency and intensified dramatically upon his return to office in 2025. August 2019, Trump first expressed interest in purchasing Greenland from Denmark. The Danish Prime Minister called the idea absurd. Trump canceled a planned state visit in retaliation and continued pressuring Denmark intermittently for years. November 2025, Trump deployed the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to the Caribbean and conducted military operations on Venezuelan territory, citing counter-narcotics justifications but effectively demonstrating American power to impose presence on sovereign nations without their consent. December 2024. Even before taking office for his second term, Trump began calling Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau governor of the great state of Canada and suggesting Canada should become the 51st state to avoid tariffs. 3 distinct territories. 3 different relationships with the United States. One common theme: Trump believes American power should translate into territorial expansion, using whatever mechanisms achieve that goal: purchase, coercion, or military presence. But Canada represents the most ambitious target. Greenland has 57,000 people. Venezuela, while larger, is economically devastated and politically isolated. Canada is a G7 nation of 39 million people, the world's 9th largest economy, a founding NATO member, and America's largest trading partner. Annexing Canada wouldn't be a symbolic acquisition of strategic territory. It would be the absorption of a major developed economy and the effective erasure of an independent nation with deeper democratic traditions than the United States itself. Yet Trump has pursued this goal with remarkable consistency, using tools that reveal the modern mechanisms of territorial ambition. Trump's primary tool for pressuring Canada has been tariffs, taxes on imported goods that can devastate an economy as trade-dependent as Canada's. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. That's $437 billion annually. Canada's entire economic structure is oriented around seamless cross-border commerce, integrated supply chains, and the assumption that the U.S.-Canada border functions essentially as an administrative line rather than a true barrier. Trump has weaponized this dependence. Beginning in January 2025, he threatened 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods unless Canada addressed what Trump called unacceptable levels of illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking across the border. These accusations were largely fabricated. The northern border accounts for a tiny fraction of illegal immigration compared to the southern border. Fentanyl entering from Canada is minimal compared to flows from Mexico. But the factual basis didn't matter. The threat created leverage. In March 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, devastating industries concentrated in Ontario and Quebec. He extended these to hundreds of derivative products, everything from construction materials to beverage cans. Canada retaliated with its own tariffs on American goods. But the asymmetry was obvious. Canada's $437 billion in exports to the U.S. far exceeds America's $356 billion in exports to Canada. A trade war hurts Canada more than it hurts the United States. Trump made this explicit. They've been very bad to us on trade. Historically, Canada has been very unfair in trade. So we'll see how this develops. I would love to see Canada become the 51st state. The message was clear. Accept annexation and tariffs disappear. Maintain independence and face economic strangulation. This isn't military conquest. It's economic coercion designed to make sovereignty too expensive to maintain. The economic pressure didn't just hurt Canada's economy. It destroyed Justin Trudeau's government. Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, representing a progressive vision of multiculturalism, climate action, and international cooperation. For nearly a decade, he personified Canadian identity distinct from American conservatism. But Trudeau had no effective response to Trump's economic warfare. He imposed retaliatory tariffs, but Canada's smaller economy meant this hurt Canadian consumers as much as it pressured America. He appealed to international law and trade agreements, but Trump ignored these constraints. He sought support from European allies, but they had their own Trump problems and limited capacity to help. By late 2024, Trudeau's political position had collapsed. His Liberal Party trailed the Conservative Party by over 20 points in polling. Within his own party, members openly called for his resignation. The crisis wasn't primarily about domestic policy, it was about Trudeau's inability to protect Canada from American economic aggression. On January 6, 2025, Trudeau announced his resignation as Prime Minister and Liberal Party leader. He cited the need for new leadership to navigate the Trump challenge. But the reality was that Trump's pressure had made Trudeau's continued governance politically impossible. The Liberal Party chose Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, to replace Trudeau. Carney positioned himself as a tough economic technocrat who could stand up to Trump's bullying. Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister on March 14, 2025. His first statement emphasized defending Canadian sovereignty and maintaining tariffs on American goods until the U.S. showed respect for Canada. But Carney's defiance came at enormous cost. The tariff war continued. The Canadian economy entered recession. And Trump's rhetoric about annexation intensified rather than diminished. In May 2025, Trump made an offer that revealed his transactional understanding of national identity. He would give Canada a replica of the U.S. Capitol's Gold Dome, free of charge, if Canada agreed to become the 51st state. The offer was simultaneously absurd and revealing. Trump seemed to believe that national sovereignty could be traded for architectural symbols and economic benefits. That Canada's 158 years of independent history, distinct political culture, and national identity could be overridden by the appeal of tax savings and access to American military protection. "I've been talking to Canada about the Golden Dome," Trump told reporters. "They could have it for free if they join us. No more taxes, tremendous military protection, and they'd save billions. It's a great deal for them." Canadian officials didn't dignify the offer with formal response. But the proposal illustrated Trump's fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate dismissal of why nations value sovereignty beyond economic calculation. Canada isn't independent because it's profitable. It's independent because Canadians have built institutions, identity, and political culture distinct from the United States. The Canadian healthcare system, parliamentary democracy, constitutional monarchy, multicultural policies, and foreign policy orientation differ fundamentally from American approaches. These differences aren't accidents to be corrected. They're choices reflecting different values and historical development. Offering economic incentives to abandon them treats sovereignty as a commodity rather than an expression of collective identity and self-determination. But Trump's offer also revealed a strategic assessment. He believed economic pressure could eventually make enough Canadians willing to trade independence for material benefits. And in at least some regions, he might be right. If Trump's strategy is to acquire Canada through economic pressure and internal fragmentation, Alberta is the obvious wedge. Alberta is Canada's most conservative province, its richest in natural resources, and the one most ideologically aligned with American conservatism. It holds approximately 170 billion barrels of oil in tar sands reserves, the third largest proven oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Alberta contributes massively to Canadian federal revenues but receives comparatively less in federal spending. Its conservative population resents what it sees as subsidies to poorer, more liberal provinces in the east. And Alberta's oil industry has clashed repeatedly with federal climate policies that prioritize emissions reduction over fossil fuel development. This creates fertile ground for separatism. The Wexit movement, Western Canadian exit from Canada, modeled on Brexit, has advocated Alberta independence for years. Until recently, it was a fringe movement with minimal support. Trump changed that calculation. In June 2025, representatives from the Alberta Prosperity Project met with Trump administration officials in Washington. The meetings reportedly discussed American recognition of an independent Alberta and potential annexation to the United States following a successful independence referendum. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith publicly rejected these overtures, stating she did not want foreign interference in Alberta's constitutional debates. But the mere fact that such meetings occurred demonstrated Trump's strategy: fracture Canada by supporting provincial separatism, then absorb the pieces. The model has historical precedent. In 1836, American settlers in Mexican Texas declared independence, then sought annexation to the United States. Texas became the 28th state in 1845. Trump explicitly referenced this history. We did it with Texas. We can do it with Alberta. For Albertans, the calculation is complex. Independence from Canada would mean losing access to Canadian markets, federal transfers, and established institutions. But joining the United States would mean access to the vast American market, alignment with a pro-oil federal government, and potentially lower taxes. Polling shows approximately 19% of Albertans support joining the United States, a minority, but a significant one that could grow under sustained economic pressure. Trump's annexation rhetoric isn't entirely without precedent. The United States has a long history of territorial expansion through mechanisms other than military conquest. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803, the U.S. bought 828,000 square miles from France for $15 million, doubling national territory through purchase. Texas annexation, 1845, American settlers in Mexican territory declared independence, then sought annexation. The U.S. accepted, triggering war with Mexico. Mexican cession, 1848, following military victory, the U.S. acquired present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Alaska Purchase, 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, acquiring territory larger than all but 18 current nations. Hawaii annexation, 1898, American business interests overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893. The U.S. initially refused annexation, but strategic considerations during the Spanish-American War led to formal acquisition in 1898. These acquisitions used various mechanisms: purchase from European powers, annexation of breakaway territories, military conquest, and absorption of overthrown governments. But none involved annexing a developed democracy with long-established institutions and strong national identity. Hawaii comes closest, but the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 was a small Pacific monarchy, not a G7 industrial economy. The population was approximately 100,000, not 39 million. And the annexation occurred over 125 years ago, in an era when imperial expansion was accepted practice. Modern international law, codified in the UN Charter, explicitly prohibits territorial acquisition by force and requires respect for self-determination. Buying territory from willing sellers might be legally defensible, but coercing annexation through economic pressure exists in legal gray zones. Trump seems to believe these historical precedents justify current ambitions. Critics argue that applying 19th-century imperial logic to 21st-century geopolitics violates fundamental principles of the post-1945 international order. The Texas precedent is particularly relevant to Trump's Alberta strategy because it demonstrates how separatism can serve as a pathway to annexation. In the 1820s, Mexico encouraged American settlement in its sparsely populated northern territory of Texas, hoping settlers would develop the region and defend against Native American raids. By 1835, American settlers outnumbered Mexican citizens in Texas approximately 10-1. Cultural and political conflicts developed. American settlers wanted slavery legalized, which Mexico had abolished. They resented centralized governance from Mexico City, and they maintained stronger cultural ties to the United States than to Mexico. In 1835, tensions erupted into armed conflict. American settlers declared independence in 1836, establishing the Republic of Texas. They immediately sought annexation to the United States. The U.S. initially hesitated, fearing war with Mexico and domestic political conflicts over whether Texas would be admitted as a slave state. But in 1845, President John Tyler pushed through annexation. Texas became the 28th state, triggering the Mexican-American War. This sequence, settlement by external population, growing separatism, declaration of independence, annexation by the settlers' origin country, provides a template Trump apparently sees as applicable to Alberta. The differences are obvious. Albertans aren't American settlers in foreign territory. They're Canadian citizens with deep roots in Canadian Confederation. Alberta joined Canada in 1905, making it far more integrated into Canadian identity than Texas ever was into Mexico. But the economic and cultural dynamics share similarities. Like Texas settlers who felt Mexico City didn't represent their interests, many Albertans feel Ottawa prioritizes eastern provinces over western concerns. Like Texas settlers economically linked to the American South, Albertans are economically integrated with American energy markets. Trump's strategy appears to be, encourage these grievances, support separatist movements, offer American recognition of independence, then present annexation as the logical next step. Mark Carney understood that defending Canada required more than economic policy. It required rallying Canadian nationalism against American pressure. Carney's background provided credibility. Having led both Canadian and British central banks through financial crises, he positioned himself as someone who understood economic pressure and knew how to resist it. But Carney also recognized that economic retaliation alone wouldn't work. Canada needed to make sovereignty emotionally compelling, to remind Canadians what they would lose if annexation occurred. Carney's rhetoric emphasized Canadian distinctiveness, universal health care that Americans lacked, parliamentary democracy that avoided American partisan gridlock, multicultural policies that created a more inclusive society, and a foreign policy independent of American imperial ambitions. "We are not Americans, and we never will be," Carney stated in his first major speech as Prime Minister. "We respect our neighbors, but we will not surrender our identity to avoid economic inconvenience." The strategy worked politically. Polling showed the Liberal Party, which had been more than 20 points behind when Trudeau resigned, surging to first place after Carney became leader. By April 2025, the Liberals won a federal election that many analysts had predicted would destroy them. Carney's victory came despite, or perhaps because of, Trump's intensified pressure. The more Trump threatened Canada, the more Canadians rallied behind leaders who promised to resist. But electoral success didn't solve the underlying problem. Canada's economy remained vulnerable to American tariffs, and Carney had no effective tools to compel Trump to change course. Maintaining retaliatory tariffs inflicted economic pain on Canadian consumers and businesses. Removing them would appear weak and encourage further American pressure. Carney's government thus faced an impossible choice: accept economic damage to preserve sovereignty, or negotiate concessions that might lead incrementally toward the subordination Trump sought. By mid-2025, the trade war between the United States and Canada had pushed the Canadian economy into recession. Manufacturing sectors dependent on American markets faced catastrophic losses. Auto plants in Ontario scaled back production or closed entirely as 25% tariffs made Canadian-made vehicles uncompetitive. Steel and aluminum producers laid off thousands of workers. Agricultural exports to the U.S. declined sharply. The Bank of Canada cut interest rates repeatedly to stimulate the economy, but monetary policy couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. Canada's economic structure assumed frictionless trade with the United States, and that assumption no longer held. Unemployment rose to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Consumer confidence collapsed. Business investment froze as companies faced uncertainty about future trade conditions. Trump celebrated these outcomes. "They're feeling the pain," he told reporters. "They'll come around. Canada will see that joining us makes sense. No tariffs, instant prosperity. It's the art of the deal." But the economic pain also strengthened Canadian resolve in unexpected ways. Rather than blaming their own government for refusing annexation, many Canadians blamed Trump for imposing illegitimate economic warfare. Nationalist sentiment intensified. Canadian media coverage overwhelmingly framed the conflict as American bullying of a smaller neighbor rather than as legitimate trade disputes. Images of shuttered factories were juxtaposed with Trump's smirking declarations about annexation, creating powerful emotional associations between economic suffering and the need to resist American pressure. This presented Trump with a dilemma his transactional worldview hadn't anticipated. Economic pain was supposed to make Canadians accept annexation as relief. Instead, it was making them angrier and more determined to maintain independence despite the cost. The question was how long this determination could last if economic conditions continued deteriorating. Economic pressure is one thing. But if Trump decided to escalate beyond tariffs, could Canada actually defend itself militarily? The answer is uncomfortable, not against the United States. Canada's military is professional, well-trained, and capable of contributing to international missions. Canadian forces have distinguished themselves in Afghanistan, Libya, and numerous peacekeeping operations. The Canadian Special Operations Forces are highly regarded globally. But Canada's military is small and designed for expeditionary operations, not defending against the world's most powerful military on a 5,525-mile shared border. Canada's entire active military force totals approximately 68,000 personnel. The United States has 1.3 million active duty service members, nearly 20 times larger. Canada's defense budget is approximately $27 billion annually. America's exceeds $850 billion, over 30 times larger. Canada operates 79 CF-18 fighter jets, most nearing the end of their service lives. The U.S. Air Force operates over 5,000 aircraft, including the world's most advanced fighters and bombers. Canada has no aircraft carriers, no long-range bombers, no ballistic missile submarines. More fundamentally, Canadian defense planning has always assumed the United States is an ally, not a threat. Canada's northern defenses are designed to monitor Arctic sovereignty against Russian encroachment, not to repel American invasion. If the United States decided to occupy Canada militarily, Canadian forces could resist for days or perhaps weeks before being overwhelmed. Canada has no nuclear weapons and couldn't acquire them quickly enough to create deterrence. This reality shapes the entire dynamic of Trump's annexation campaign. Canada cannot defend itself by force. Its only defenses are political, maintaining internal unity and international support that makes forcible annexation too politically costly for America to attempt. But those defenses require conditions that Trump's economic warfare is designed to erode. Canada is a founding member of NATO. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. In theory, American military action against Canada would trigger collective defense obligations. In practice, NATO's response to Trump's annexation rhetoric has been nearly silent. European NATO members face an impossible dilemma. They depend on American military power for deterrence against Russia. Alienating Trump by strongly defending Canada could jeopardize American commitment to European defense. Moreover, Trump has repeatedly threatened to withdraw from NATO or reduce American contributions. European leaders fear that forcefully opposing American pressure on Canada might trigger precisely the NATO collapse they're desperate to avoid. So European responses have been carefully calibrated: expressions of support for Canadian sovereignty, affirmations of the sanctity of borders, but no concrete commitments to defend Canada against American pressure. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, when asked about Trump's annexation comments, emphasized that NATO respects the sovereignty of all member nations, but avoided condemning American actions or discussing alliance obligations if the U.S.-Canada dispute escalated. This silence reveals a fundamental weakness in collective security systems. They only function when the threat comes from outside the alliance. When the most powerful alliance member becomes the threat to another member, the alliance has no effective response mechanism. Canada cannot invoke NATO protection against the United States. European NATO members won't risk transatlantic relations to defend Canada. And Trump knows this, which makes his pressure campaign less risky than targeting a non-NATO nation might be. The only real constraint on American behavior is political will in the United States itself, whether Americans would accept annexing Canada despite Canadian objections. Polling on American attitudes toward annexing Canada reveals complex and somewhat surprising patterns. A Reuters Ipsos poll from July 2025 found that 23% of Americans supported Trump's proposal to make Canada the 51st state. 38% opposed it. 39% were unsure or hadn't thought about it. These numbers suggest significant openness to annexation despite the obvious complications. Nearly a quarter of Americans actively support the idea, and the plurality who are unsure could be persuaded depending on how the issue is framed. Breaking down the numbers reveals predictable partisan divides. 41% of Republicans support annexation compared to 12% of Democrats. But even among Democrats, opposition isn't overwhelming. 53% opposed, but 35% were unsure. The arguments for and against reflect different values. Supporters emphasize economic benefits, eliminating trade barriers, accessing Canadian resources, expanding American territory, and fixing Canada's political system by bringing it under American governance. Opponents cite international law violations, the problem of incorporating 39 million people who don't want to be Americans, and concerns about whether forcing annexation aligns with American values of freedom and self-determination. Interestingly, many Americans seem to believe Canadians would benefit from annexation. A CNN poll found that 31% of Americans think most Canadians would prefer becoming Americans if given the choice, a dramatic misreading of Canadian opinion, where support for annexation consistently polls below 15%. This misperception matters because it makes the annexation pitch easier. If Americans believe they're helping Canadians by offering them American citizenship, it's easier to justify pressure tactics that would otherwise seem like bullying. Trump has actively cultivated this perception, repeatedly claiming that many Canadians support joining the United States and that Canada would prosper as the 51st state. If Trump's annexation plan has a fatal flaw, it's Quebec. Quebec is Canada's second most populous province with 8.7 million residents, nearly 23% of Canada's population. It's majority French-speaking, culturally distinct from the rest of Canada, and has a powerful independence movement that nearly succeeded in separating from Canada in referendums in 1980 and 1995. Quebec's relationship with Canada is complex. Many Québécois feel Canada doesn't adequately recognize French-Canadian culture and language rights. The sovereignty movement remains politically significant, with the Part 1 Québécois and Bloc Québécois representing independence-oriented constituencies. But Québécois separatism is about preserving French-Canadian identity, not joining the United States. An independent Quebec would be a French-speaking republic maintaining close ties with France and La Francophonie, the global community of French-speaking nations. Annexing Quebec to the United States would be culturally catastrophic for French-Canadian identity. The U.S. has no official language but operates overwhelmingly in English. American federalism provides states less autonomy than Canadian provinces enjoy. U.S. immigration and cultural policies don't prioritize protecting minority linguistic communities the way Canadian policy protects French language rights. In polling, support for joining the United States is even lower in Quebec than in other Canadian provinces, approximately 8% compared to a national average around 13%. This creates an impossible situation for Trump's annexation scenario. Canada cannot be annexed without Quebec. But Quebec won't accept annexation to the United States. Any attempt to force annexation would likely trigger Quebec independence, fragmenting Canada but not achieving Trump's goal of a unified 51st state. Trump has never publicly addressed this problem. His annexation rhetoric treats Canada as a homogeneous entity that would simply become American. The reality is far more complicated. Beyond Trump's rhetoric about tariffs and statehood, a strategic question emerges. What does the United States actually gain by annexing Canada? The answer isn't primarily territory. America already has vast land. Its resources and strategic assets that Canada uniquely provides. Oil. Alberta's 170 billion barrels of oil reserves would make the United States the world's largest oil reserve holder, surpassing Saudi Arabia. This would transform global energy geopolitics and ensure American energy independence for generations. Fresh water. Canada holds approximately 20% of the world's fresh water. As climate change makes water scarcity a critical issue, this resource becomes increasingly valuable. American control would secure water supplies for the southwestern U.S. Minerals. Canada has massive reserves of rare earth elements, uranium, gold, nickel, and other strategic minerals essential for electronics, batteries, and military applications. Currently, China dominates rare earth supply chains. Canadian resources could break that dependence. Arctic territory. Canada claims vast Arctic territories that may hold significant oil and gas reserves and control strategic shipping routes opening as ice melts. American annexation would extend U.S. sovereignty far into the Arctic, competing with Russian and Chinese claims. Hydroelectric power. Quebec and British Columbia generate massive amounts of hydroelectric power that could supply American markets, supporting decarbonization efforts while ensuring energy security. Timber. Canada's forests represent enormous renewable resources for construction and manufacturing. Combined, these resources would dramatically enhance American strategic autonomy, reducing dependence on foreign suppliers for energy, water, minerals, and materials. This helps explain Trump's fixation. From a purely transactional perspective, annexing Canada would be the largest resource acquisition in American history, potentially worth trillions of dollars in long-term strategic value. The question is whether such value justifies coercing a democratic ally into surrendering sovereignty. If the United States successfully annexes Canada through economic coercion, the precedent reverberates globally. Russia immediately gains justification for claims on Ukraine and former Soviet states. If America can pressure neighbors into annexation, why can't Russia do the same in its sphere of influence? China's claims on Taiwan become harder for the West to oppose. If economic integration and geographic proximity justify American annexation of Canada, similar arguments apply to Chinese claims that Taiwan is historically Chinese territory that should be reunified. India's disputes with Pakistan over Kashmir, Morocco's claims on Western Sahara, Azerbaijan's designs on Armenia. Dozens of territorial disputes that have been frozen by international norms against forcible annexation would be unfrozen. The principle that borders are sacred and cannot be changed through coercion or force has been central to international stability since 1945. That principle has been violated repeatedly, Russia in Crimea, China in the South China Sea, but the international community consistently condemns these violations. If the United States, the nation that most forcefully advocated for this principle after World War II, abandons it to annex Canada, the entire framework collapses. There's no longer a norm against territorial expansion, only questions of power. Are you strong enough to take territory, and will anyone stop you? Defenders of Trump's approach argue that Canada is a special case. Willing annexation after economic negotiation isn't comparable to military conquest. But Canadian willingness is questionable when it's produced through economic warfare that makes sovereignty unsustainably expensive. The precedent matters because it establishes that overwhelming economic power can replace military force as the mechanism of empire. This doesn't make annexation more legitimate, it simply changes the tools of coercion. In October 2025, the conflict entered a new phase: information warfare. During the World Series Baseball Championship, Canadian television broadcast advertisements celebrating Canadian sovereignty and contrasting Canadian social programs favorably with American systems. The ads featured healthcare, education, and social safety nets that Canada provides but the United States lacks. Trump reacted furiously. He called the advertisements a fraud and declared he was increasing tariffs on Canada by an additional 10% due to severe distortion of facts and flagrant misinformation. The tariff increase over television advertisements might seem absurd, but it revealed Trump's sensitivity to narratives. If Canada could convince its own population that Canadian systems were superior to American ones, resistance to annexation would strengthen. The propaganda war operates on multiple levels. Trump consistently portrays Canada as economically failing, dependent on American generosity, and better off joining the United States. Canadian media portrays Trump as a bully attempting to destroy Canadian sovereignty for American benefit. Both sides use social media, traditional media, and official statements to shape perceptions. Trump posts maps showing Canada as part of the United States, conditioning audiences to see annexation as natural. Canadian officials emphasize Canadian achievements and American problems to remind Canadians what they would lose. Younger Canadians, who consume more American media and feel less attached to traditional Canadian nationalism, are more susceptible to arguments about economic benefits of annexation. Older Canadians, with stronger memories of Canadian distinctiveness, are more resistant. The information battle aims to shape the answer to a simple question: would Canadians be better off as Americans? Trump needs enough Canadians to answer yes, that annexation appears voluntary rather than coerced. One scenario that particularly concerns Canadian officials is Trump engineering a referendum on annexation. The mechanism could work as follows. Economic pressure intensifies until Canadian living standards decline significantly. Pro-annexation voices grow louder, particularly in resource-rich provinces like Alberta. A provincial government, perhaps Alberta under pressure from separatists, calls a referendum on joining the United States. If that referendum passes, Trump recognizes the result and offers to accept the province as the 51st state. Other provinces, facing economic isolation, hold their own referendums. Canada fractures into provinces joining the U.S. separately or remaining as a diminished state. This scenario leverages democracy itself as the mechanism of annexation. If populations vote to join the United States, Trump can claim legitimacy. He's not conquering Canada, he's accepting democratic decisions. The problem is that the votes would occur under duress. If economic conditions have deteriorated due to American tariffs, and if the promise of annexation is immediate relief from those tariffs, how free is the choice? It's similar to a hostage-taker offering to release hostages if they agree to certain conditions. The agreement may be technically voluntary, but it's produced through coercion. Canadian constitutional law makes this scenario legally complex. Provinces cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. The Supreme Court ruled in 1998 that Quebec independence would require constitutional negotiations involving all provinces. But if a province held a referendum showing clear majority support for joining the U.S., and if the federal government couldn't prevent it, constitutional niceties might become irrelevant. Trump's strategy appears designed to create conditions where referendums become politically inevitable as the only way to escape economic pressure. In June 2025, Alberta's legislature passed the Alberta Self-Determination Act, a law making it significantly easier to organize and conduct independence referendums. The act reduced the signature threshold required to trigger a referendum, shortened the timeline for organizing votes, and established that a simple majority, 50% plus one vote, would be sufficient to declare independence. Premier Danielle Smith stated the law was about ensuring Albertans have the power to determine their own future if the federal government continues policies harmful to Alberta's interests. But the timing was suspicious. The law passed during the height of U.S.-Canada trade tensions, just months after Trump administration officials met with Alberta separatist leaders. The act provides a legal mechanism for exactly the scenario that concerns Canadian federal officials: a province holding a referendum, declaring independence, then immediately seeking annexation to the United States. Federal opposition parties called the act unconstitutional and demanded it be challenged in court. But legal challenges take years, and political dynamics could move faster than judicial processes. What makes the Alberta Act particularly dangerous is that it creates a template. If Alberta demonstrates that provincial independence referendums are possible, other provinces might follow. Saskatchewan, British Columbia, even Ontario could face separatist movements arguing that if Alberta can leave, they can too. This would fracture Canadian unity in ways that make federal resistance to American pressure nearly impossible. A Canada facing multiple provincial independence movements cannot effectively negotiate with the United States from a position of strength. And that may be precisely Trump's calculation. International law clearly prohibits forcible annexation. The UN Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against territorial integrity. The principle of self-determination requires that peoples freely choose their political status. If the United States invaded Canada militarily, it would violate these principles unambiguously. The international community would condemn it. Economic sanctions would follow. America's alliances would fracture. But Trump isn't planning military invasion. He's using economic pressure, propaganda, and support for internal separatism. These tactics exist in legal gray zones. Economic sanctions and tariffs are generally legal under international trade law, even if their purpose is political pressure. Countries impose sanctions routinely. Trump can argue he's simply enforcing American trade interests. Supporting political movements in other countries is more questionable, but difficult to prosecute legally. If Trump meets with Alberta separatists and expresses support for their cause, he can claim he's exercising freedom of speech and association. If Canadian provinces hold referendums and vote to join the United States, Trump can argue he's respecting democratic self-determination by accepting their choice. None of these actions constitute the kind of clear violation that international institutions can effectively address. The International Court of Justice might rule against American conduct, but the U.S. doesn't recognize ICJ jurisdiction over American actions. The UN Security Council couldn't act because the United States holds veto power. The General Assembly could condemn American conduct, but such resolutions are non-binding and have no enforcement mechanism. This reveals a fundamental weakness in international law. It constrains weak nations but provides limited constraints on powerful ones, especially when those powers use economic and political tools rather than military force. Trump appears to have learned this lesson and is exploiting it systematically. The critical question becomes temporal. How long can Canada sustain economic hardship before political will to resist collapses? As of February 2026, Canada has endured approximately 14 months of intensified trade conflict. The economy is in recession. Unemployment has risen significantly. Business investment has stalled. Consumer confidence remains low. Carney's government maintains retaliatory tariffs and rhetoric about defending sovereignty. But polls show cracks forming. Support for Carney personally remains strong, but economic anxiety is rising. In Alberta, support for independence has grown from 19% to 28% according to surveys from January 2026. That's still a minority, but the trend is concerning for federal unity. Among Canadians aged 18 to 35, support for exploring annexation as a solution to economic problems has risen to 22%, double the rate among older Canadians. Younger voters without deep attachment to traditional Canadian nationalism are more willing to consider pragmatic economic solutions. The question is what breaks first, American political will to maintain pressure or Canadian unity in resisting it? Trump faces his own constraints. American consumers are paying higher prices due to tariffs on Canadian goods. Industries dependent on Canadian inputs are lobbying for relief. And there's no guarantee Americans would actually support annexation if it came to a serious proposal. But Trump has shown unusual persistence on this issue. Unlike many of his shifting priorities, the Canada fixation has remained constant for over 2 years. He appears genuinely committed to the goal. For Canada, time works against them if economic conditions don't improve. Each month of recession, each factory closure, each percentage point rise in unemployment makes the status quo less sustainable. Carney needs either economic recovery despite tariffs or a change in American leadership. Neither is guaranteed in useful time frames. One Canadian strategy is simply waiting for Trump's presidency to end. Trump's second term concludes in January 2029. If Democrats win the 2028 election, or if a less aggressively nationalist Republican wins, the annexation pressure might end. But this strategy carries enormous risks. First, 3 years is a long time economically. Canada might not survive 3 more years of trade war without fracturing politically. Second, there's no guarantee Trump's successor would reverse course. If economic nationalism and territorial expansion become popular with American voters, future presidents might continue the policy. Third, Trump might accomplish enough before 2029 that reversing becomes impossible. If Alberta holds an independence referendum and votes to join the United States during Trump's term, that fact creates new realities that future presidents must address. Fourth, Trump might run again in 2028 if he's constitutionally allowed. The 22nd Amendment limits presidents to 2 terms, but Trump has suggested this shouldn't apply if the terms aren't consecutive, a reading most constitutional scholars reject but Trump could try to pursue. Finally, waiting for American political change means surrendering Canadian agency. Canada's fate would depend entirely on American voters' decisions rather than Canadian determination. Carney publicly rejects this approach. We will not wait for American political changes to determine Canadian sovereignty. We will defend our independence regardless of who sits in the White House. But privately, Canadian officials likely hope that American politics will solve the problem they cannot solve themselves. The scenario everyone avoids discussing publicly is what happens if economic pressure fails and Trump decides to escalate militarily. Military planners in both countries have surely considered the possibility, even if politicians won't acknowledge it. The calculus is grim. If the United States decided to occupy Canada militarily, Canadian forces would face impossible odds. Resistance would be heroic but futile. Within weeks, perhaps days, American forces would control major Canadian cities and infrastructure. But the aftermath would be catastrophic for America's global position. NATO would be destroyed. European allies would break with the United States. American moral authority would evaporate. International institutions would exclude America. Economic sanctions from Europe and potentially China would follow. Most importantly, Occupying a hostile population of 39 million would create insurgency the United States couldn't suppress. Canada wouldn't become a peaceful 51st state. It would become a massive, hostile occupied territory requiring permanent military presence to control. The costs would vastly exceed any benefits. This is why military annexation is essentially impossible despite overwhelming American military superiority. But limited military action is more plausible. Trump could order strikes against specific Canadian economic infrastructure, perhaps pipelines or power plants, to increase economic pressure without actually invading. Such actions would be illegal under international law and would trigger massive international condemnation. But they wouldn't necessarily lead to the catastrophic consequences of full invasion. The very possibility of military escalation, even if unlikely, shapes the psychology of resistance. Canadian negotiators must consider, at what point does Trump's frustration with economic pressure lead to military action? How far can Canada push before the unthinkable becomes thinkable? This uncertainty is itself a form of leverage. European nations watch the US-Canada conflict with deep concern but limited capacity to help. Britain, France, and Germany have all issued diplomatic statements supporting Canadian sovereignty and expressing concern about American trade tactics. The European Union has coordinated some policy responses. But Europe's actual leverage is minimal. European nations depend on American military power for security, particularly against Russia. Alienating Trump over Canada risks American withdrawal from European defense commitments. Europe also has its own trade vulnerabilities. Trump has threatened European economies with tariffs if they interfere in American hemisphere issues. European leaders must balance support for Canada against protecting their own economic interests. Some European support is occurring quietly. European banks are providing credit lines to Canadian companies facing liquidity problems due to trade disruptions. European governments are fast-tracking trade agreements with Canada to help diversify Canadian. Preparado usando Claude Sonnet 4.5. Continue. Exports away from dependence on the United States. But these measures are marginal compared to the scale of Canadian economic integration with America. Europe cannot replace the United States as Canada's primary economic partner. Geography, infrastructure, and decades of integration make that impossible. European leaders also recognize an uncomfortable truth. If the United States can coerce Canada into annexation despite international norms, European sovereignty from American influence may be equally fragile. The precedent threatens everyone. Yet Europeans lack the power to prevent it. This highlights the fundamental imbalance in the post-Cold War order. American power is so overwhelming that even collective action by allied democracies cannot effectively constrain it when the U.S. decides to pursue objectives aggressively. The best Europe can offer Canada is diplomatic support, modest economic assistance, and hopes that American domestic politics eventually constrain Trump's ambitions. For Canada, this reality is sobering. In a confrontation with the United States, Canada faces its southern neighbor essentially alone. While Europe agonizes over how to support Canada without antagonizing Trump, China sees opportunity. Chinese officials have offered Canada expanded trade relationships, investment in Canadian infrastructure, and diplomatic support against American pressure. In August 2025, President Xi Jinping invited Prime Minister Carney to Beijing for discussions about strengthening the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Canada. For China, supporting Canada serves multiple interests. Undermining American alliances. If China can position itself as a more reliable partner than the United States, it damages American alliance networks globally. Access to Canadian resources. China needs Canadian oil, minerals, and agricultural products. Displacing American economic dominance in Canada would secure these supplies. Precedent against coercion. If the U.S. can economically coerce neighbors, China faces similar risks in Asia. Supporting Canadian resistance establishes the principle that economic coercion shouldn't succeed. Dividing the West. Closer Canada-China ties strain Canadian relations with the United States and create divisions within Western alliance structures. But Canadian engagement with China carries enormous risks. Accepting Chinese investment and trade dependence could simply replace American pressure with Chinese influence. And closer Canada-China ties would provoke even stronger American responses. The United States has already threatened serious consequences if Canada signs major trade deals with China. Trump has suggested that Canadian betrayal through Chinese alignment would justify even more aggressive American action. Carney's government has carefully limited Chinese engagement to avoid triggering American escalation while still diversifying economic relationships enough to reduce total dependence on the U.S. But the fact that China is even an option for Canada represents a dramatic shift in North American geopolitics and a significant strategic setback for the United States, one that Trump's annexation campaign has inadvertently created. Trump's Canada obsession doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern that includes Greenland, a Danish territory with 57,000 inhabitants that Trump has tried to acquire since his first term. Greenland's strategic value is clear: potential oil and gas reserves, rare earth minerals, a massive ice sheet that affects global climate, and crucially, geographic position controlling Arctic shipping routes and providing military positioning between North America and Europe. Trump first proposed purchasing Greenland in 2019. Denmark rejected the idea as absurd. Trump canceled a state visit in retaliation and continued raising the issue periodically. In his second term, Trump has intensified pressure. He suggested that American protection of Greenland during World War II creates obligations. He's offered massive payments to Denmark. He's hinted at recognizing Greenlandic independence if Greenland then chooses to join the United States. The parallels to the Canada strategy are obvious. Identify strategic territory, offer economic incentives for acquisition, suggest the population would benefit from American governance, apply pressure if voluntary transfer doesn't occur. But Greenland is simpler than Canada. Its population is tiny. It's already semi-autonomous from Denmark. And Greenlandic politics include independence movements that might view American statehood as preferable to continued Danish association. If Trump successfully acquires Greenland, through purchase, supporting independence followed by annexation, or other means, it establishes precedent that makes the Canada campaign more credible. It demonstrates that Trump's territorial ambitions aren't just rhetoric and that he has mechanisms to achieve them. Conversely, if the Greenland effort fails definitively, it might discourage the Canada campaign by showing that modern democratic nations cannot simply be acquired regardless of American power. As of February 2026, Greenland remains Danish territory, but Trump continues pursuing it alongside his Canada ambitions. Trump's third announced annexation target, Venezuela, reveals different dynamics than either Canada or Greenland. Venezuela is economically devastated, politically isolated, and has a population desperate for relief from hyperinflation, shortages, and authoritarian governance. In this context, American annexation might actually appeal to significant portions of the population. Unlike Canada, where annexation would destroy a functioning democracy, Venezuelan state institutions have already largely collapsed. The question isn't whether annexation would disrupt a stable system, but whether American governance could rebuild a failed state. Trump's Venezuela strategy has been more directly coercive, military operations framed as counter-narcotics but effectively demonstrating American power to operate on Venezuelan territory, support for opposition movements, and offers to Venezuelan refugees that American statehood would grant them citizenship and access to the American economy. For Venezuelans who have fled to neighboring countries as refugees, the promise of American citizenship is genuinely attractive. For those remaining in Venezuela facing economic catastrophe, American annexation might seem preferable to continued deterioration under current leadership. This creates a scenario where annexation could potentially be voluntary in ways that Canada will never be. If a post-Maduro Venezuelan government invited American annexation as the path to reconstruction and stability, it would have different legitimacy than coercing Canada. But Venezuela also reveals the complications of annexation. The country faces massive infrastructure deficits, requires trillions in reconstruction investment, and has a population with no experience of American political culture. Integrating 28 million Venezuelans as American citizens would be far more challenging than integrating Canada's already aligned society. The three targets together, Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, represent different mechanisms of territorial expansion: economic coercion of a developed ally, purchase or supported independence of a strategic territory, and absorption of a failed state through offering governance. As of early February 2026, the situation remains in dangerous equilibrium. Canada has survived 14 months of trade war without fragmenting politically. Carney's government maintains strong polling numbers despite economic recession. Canadian nationalism has, if anything, strengthened under pressure. But economic conditions continue deteriorating. Canadian GDP contracted 2.3% in 2025. Unemployment stands at 8.7%, the highest since 2009. Business bankruptcies have increased 34%. Consumer spending has fallen as households prioritize saving amid economic uncertainty. Trump shows no signs of backing down. He continues posting maps showing Canada as part of the United States. He refers to Canadian officials as provincial administrators rather than national leaders. And he's threatened additional tariffs if Canada doesn't start negotiating seriously about our future together. Provincial tensions are rising. Alberta's independence movement has gained momentum. Saskatchewan has hinted at following Alberta's path. Even Ontario, traditionally federalist, has seen polling showing 18% support for exploring alternatives to Confederation if economic conditions don't improve. International support for Canada remains mostly rhetorical. No nation has offered concrete assistance that changes Canada's strategic position. NATO has essentially ignored the crisis. The UN has issued statements about respecting sovereignty but taken no action. The stalemate cannot last indefinitely. Something must break, either American pressure relents, Canadian unity fractures, or an external shock changes the dynamics. Trump faces his own pressures. American farmers hurt by Canadian retaliatory tariffs want relief. Border states economically integrated with Canada are suffering. And some Republicans worry that annexation talk damages America's reputation and alliance relationships. But Trump has made annexation a signature issue. Backing down would represent political defeat he's unlikely to accept willingly. 3 basic scenarios describe possible outcomes over the next 12 to 24 months. Scenario 1. Canadian fragmentation. Continued economic pressure triggers provincial independence movements. Alberta holds a referendum and votes to join the United States. Saskatchewan follows. The federal government cannot prevent provincial exits. Canada fragments into regions that separately negotiate with the United States. Within 3 to 5 years, most former Canadian provinces have become American states or territories. Probability: moderate. Economic pressure is creating the conditions for this outcome, but Canadian nationalism may prove more resilient than Trump assumes. Scenario 2. Negotiated subordination. Canada accepts a status short of annexation but involving significant sovereignty concessions. Perhaps a North American Union that maintains nominal Canadian independence while integrating economies completely under American leadership, eliminating tariffs but giving the U.S. veto power over Canadian foreign policy, defense, and major economic decisions. Probability: moderate. This allows both sides to claim victory while achieving Trump's substantive goals without the complications of formal annexation. Scenario 3. Exhaustion and return to status quo. American pressure eventually relents due to domestic political costs, international pushback, or Trump leaving office. Canada survives economically despite recession. Gradually, relations normalize while both sides nurse grievances. The annexation campaign is remembered as a dangerous episode that failed. Probability: moderate to low. This requires either Trump backing down, unlikely, or Canadian endurance lasting until political change in the U.S., uncertain. Each scenario has different implications for international order, alliance structures, and the precedents it establishes for great power behavior. What's certain is that the current stalemate, maximum pressure from the U.S., maximum resistance from Canada, cannot continue indefinitely. Within 18 to 24 months, one of these outcomes or some variant will likely emerge. The campaign to annex Canada represents something historically unprecedented, an attempt to expand empire through economic coercion rather than military conquest. Throughout history, territorial expansion required military power. Rome conquered through legions. European empires used naval power and colonial armies. Even recent annexations, Russia taking Crimea, for example, ultimately relied on military force. Trump's approach is different. He's attempting to make Canadian independence economically unsustainable, creating conditions where populations voluntarily seek annexation as relief from imposed economic hardship. This method has advantages over military conquest. It avoids the international condemnation and alliance fractures that invasion would trigger. It can be presented as respecting self-determination if populations vote for annexation. And it's harder to oppose legally since economic pressure exists in gray zones of international law. But it also reveals vulnerabilities in the modern international system. Economic interdependence, celebrated for decades as creating peace through mutual benefit, can be weaponized by the stronger party. The assumption that democracies don't threaten each other breaks down when one democracy is overwhelmingly more powerful. Canada's situation forces uncomfortable questions for all nations. What does sovereignty mean when a stronger neighbor can make independence economically catastrophic? How do international institutions protect smaller democracies from economic coercion by powerful allies? At what point does economic pressure become a form of aggression requiring collective response? These aren't abstract questions. They affect European nations facing potential American pressure, Asian nations navigating between US and Chinese economic power, and any country whose independence depends on trade relationships with more powerful partners. The outcome of Trump's Canada campaign will establish precedents that shape international relations for decades. If economic coercion succeeds in forcing Canada toward annexation, it validates this approach and encourages others to try it. If Canada successfully resists, it demonstrates that sovereignty can be defended even against overwhelming economic pressure. As of February 2026, the outcome remains uncertain. Canada is wounded but not broken. American pressure continues but hasn't yet achieved its goal. And the world watches to see whether the map of North America will be redrawn not through war, but through the slow grinding of economic leverage against democratic institutions. The longest undefended border in the world, a symbol of peaceful coexistence between neighbors, may become the testing ground for whether sovereignty can survive in an age where economic interdependence gives the powerful new tools to dominate the weak. History is unfolding in real time along that border. The question isn't just whether Canada becomes the 51st state. It's whether the entire framework of national independence, built painfully over centuries of conflict, can withstand the pressures of economic globalization when one nation holds overwhelming power. Trump's campaign to annex Canada is about more than two countries. It's about whether empire can be built without armies, whether democracy protects sovereignty when economics favor domination, and whether the world of independent nations will survive the 21st century or give way to new forms of hierarchy disguised as integration. The answer will be written in the choices made by Canadians facing impossible pressures, Americans deciding what their power should be used for, and an international community that must determine whether it has the will and mechanisms to defend principles it claims to value. The 51st state may or may not come to exist. But the campaign to create it has already changed the world by demonstrating that in the modern era, empire doesn't require invasion. It requires only making independence too expensive to maintain. And that lesson, once learned, cannot be unlearned.